I think I should begin by clarifying that this video is not fringe science, as much as it may initially appear to be. The idea of biological prescience, or the ability of living organisms to correctly predict future outcomes, has been around since at least 1985, when esteemed biophysicist Robert Rosen published his 436-page book on anticipatory systems, which, as the name suggests, describes the way that biological systems can anticipate changes in their environment, which, if you think about it, is what prescience is really all about. To date, this book has been cited 2,483 times, so not fringe science. Prescience belongs much more to the realms of biology than it does to science fiction. Yes, just like the Fremen were claiming their planet Arrakis back, I'll be claiming prescience back for biology. When you think about all the things that are happening inside your body, all these things can be categorized as either being reactionary or anticipatory, based on how these things or systems respond to stimuli. A reactionary biological system will only act after a stimulus or change in the environment has taken place. It's therefore entirely dependent on signals from the environment and will respond by initiating a corrective response in a feedback loop. Anticipatory systems, on the other hand, are much cooler because they can respond to a stimulus before the stimulus has even taken place or been detected. And that's because rather than waiting for the stimulus, an anticipatory system will rely on internal models and feed-forward loops to predict something that hasn't happened yet. And examples of these feed-forward loops can be found in many living organisms around us, including those that lack a brain or even a nervous system, like E. coli. In 2008, scientists from Princeton University were able to show that E. coli, a unicellular organism with a genome that's 600 times smaller than our own DNA, was capable of predictive behavior. This predictive behavior, or biological prescience, allowed it to manipulate which of its genes were active and which genes were not. This makes it possible for E. coli to thrive in different environments, which is kind of important considering E. coli's life cycle that sees it go from living in the soil to entering its poor hosts through the mouth, only to later end up in its host's intestines. Throughout this life cycle, E. coli will be subjected to fluctuations in temperature and, more crucially, oxygen, which means E. coli will need to shift its metabolism from relying on aerobic respiration when it's in the oxygen-rich environment of the soil to relying on anaerobic respiration in the oxygen-poor environment of your guts. Now, what the scientists were able to show in their 2008 experiments was that E. coli was able to switch on the genes for anaerobic respiration well before it entered the guts, by using another stimulus which reliably preceded or predicted E. coli experiencing the oxygen-poor environment in the intestines. That other stimulus, of course, being the rise in temperature that the bacteria experienced when they entered its host through the mouth. In fact, if you increase the temperature and keep E. coli in an oxygen-rich environment, it will counterintuitively almost always make the switch to anaerobic respiration, led astray by its own biological prescience and the environmental patterns that this biological prescience is built upon.
The decision-making wasn't very clever.
I know what you're going to say, that this is clearly not prescience if it could be proven wrong. But remember the duel between Paul and Jamis towards the end of the first Dune film? Paul ends up killing Jamis, despite having had visions where he saw Jamis as a mentor and a friend in some other alternative timeline. So even in Frank Herbert's Dune, a prescient vision can lead you astray. It's not necessarily true or reality or what will happen. I think this is really important because this is what biological prescience is all about. It's taking environmental patterns and recognizing these patterns, all with the aim to predict future outcomes. I'll even go as far as to argue that Frank Herbert likely shared this view of prescience, as characters like Paul and Lady Jessica only really unlock their prescient ability after consuming copious amounts of the spice melange, which, along with prescience, provides them with access to all their ancestors' memories, every single one of their thousands of ancestors over the course of human history. Lots and lots and lots of people. I'm not entirely sure if a single human brain can handle all that information or all that trauma, but supposing it can, and supposing that all these ancestral memories are able to serve as some sort of training data set for that individual, it's easy to see how access to ancestral memories can serve as some kind of prerequisite to prescience, as these ancestral memories provide a huge amount of raw data from which patterns can be recognized and extrapolated, only to later be used to model and predict future events. The scale that we see this happen in Dune is obviously much larger and grander than we see in the natural world, but the basic concepts are the same, because prescience is biology more than it is science fiction, especially in light of the studies that we have on genetic memory.
I'm able to recall hundreds of important details at the drop of a hat.
In one 2014 study, mice that were exposed to and were trained to fear a specific smell passed on this aversion to their descendants, who were extremely fearful of the same smell despite never having encountered it. More recently, according to a 2023 paper published in Nature, not only can memories be passed down through generations, but associative memories can be inherited as well. In this specific study, scientists from Israel trained roundworms to associate the smell of isoamyl alcohol, a smell that roundworms usually like and are attracted to, with starvation, by exposing the worms to isoamyl alcohol and then starving the roundworms afterwards. Once that association was established and the worms became avoidant of the smell, knowing of course that it would eventually lead to starvation, the worms were allowed to reproduce, and their offspring and offspring's offspring showed similar avoidant behavior towards isoamyl alcohol. Funnily enough, the offspring that displayed the greatest aversion to isoamyl alcohol, or the strongest associative genetic memory, were also the ones most likely to survive being starved, because they possessed the biological prescience to activate cellular stress responses in anticipation of and to prepare for being starved. In the scientist's own words, moreover, inheritance of the cellular stress responses increased survival chances of the progeny, as exposure to the training odorant allowed the animals to prepare in advance for an impending adversity. These findings suggest that in C. elegans, associative memories and cellular changes may be transferred across generations. I just want to take the time to point out that this is genuinely one of the best studies published in 2023. As you can see, the original manuscript was originally received by Nature in 2020, but it took nearly 3 years to publish, during which the authors of the paper worked with the reviewers to improve the quality of the study. This included carrying out a number of additional experiments to further support the findings. That's why the review process took so long. The scientists literally had to go away and do a bunch of new experiments to ensure that their research was of the highest quality. The reason I say all of this is because I came across a comment that called scientific journals like Nature and Science parasites, which I feel is a bit of an outrageous comment considering the tremendous work that these journals do, and their reviewers of course, in safeguarding the integrity of science and scientific research. But regardless of what the self-appointed sanctimonious experts on Reddit would have you believe, without scientific journals like Nature and Science, our collective faith and trust in scientists would likely rival that of our faith and trust in politicians. Of course, when we say genetic memories, we are almost always referring to the epigenetic modifications that take place in response to environmental stimuli, which can activate or silence certain genes, and which can be inherited by future generations. However, these epigenetic modifications are frequently lost after 2 generations in mammals, which means that the great-grandchildren of the mice that were taught to fear one specific odor would likely not have the same apprehensions of their parents, grandparents, and great-grandparents. Plants, however, are a totally different story. Plants have more robust epigenetic inheritance mechanisms, meaning that epigenetic modifications tend to be much more long-lasting than those in mammals. We don't typically associate prescience and memory with plants, but perhaps we should, since plants seem able to utilize past environmental experiences from many generations ago to anticipate and adapt to future conditions. That prescience is evidenced in this 2024 paper where a particularly industrious scientist from Egypt was able to show that wheat exposed to drought became biologically prescient, with the offspring of the stressed wheat showing enhanced germination rate and more robust root development, which can be interpreted as an anticipation of drought informed by the wheat's own genetic memory. And unlike in mammals, these genetic memories will persist for many generations forward. I don't know why, but a research paper about wheat and drought coming from Egypt seems like the most natural thing ever. One could even say you would likely not require much in the way of prescience to predict this paper. In the previous video I did last year, which I'm very proud to say, flopped, I talked about neuroforecasting, which is a rapidly emerging field in neuroscience that aims to use a combination of brain imaging and neurophysiology to predict population-wide behaviors.
What?
No wonder the video flopped now that I think about it. Sounds very complicated, but you know, it's really not. Because neuroforecasting is all about the idea that humans are intrinsically prescient, though we may not necessarily realize it. This prescience comes from our ability to recognize patterns, and because most of us out there are able to recognize the same patterns and come to the same conclusions from these patterns, we in theory should be able to use the prescience of a small group of people to predict events at a larger scale. And a ton of research actually supports this idea. For example, we have a 2021 study, which I discussed in that video on neuroforecasting. It's a study from Stanford that shows how brain signals from the anterior insula of university students who've had no stock trading experience were accurately able to predict whether the price of a stock went up or down the following day just by looking at the past 30 days of that stock's price action. The really cool part of that study was that the activation of the anterior insula was a better predictor of future stock prices than the university students' final choices. In other words, there may be biological prescient signals taking place inside each one of us that we may just not be listening to or might be completely unaware of, which naturally leads me to wonder whether awareness of one's own prescience has to be a prerequisite for prescience or not. I honestly had no idea, so I went on Google looking for an answer, and unfortunately I came up with nothing. It's a bit weird knowing that your shower thoughts that you had outside the shower are just too weird even for Google. Which is why I'd like to hear what you guys think. Is awareness of one's own prescience a prerequisite for prescience? My name is Hashem and I'm a medical doctor. I make videos about science. It's just as simple as that. So subscribe if that's your cup of tea.